Okay. Right, so I'm going to start this speak aloud thing whilst I build a patch. I'm going to spend about an hour doing this patch, so let's see how we go. Alright, first thing I want to do is just maybe get a sound source. I was playing around before, just really briefly, with the 261. I like the 261, both for the timbral variation, but also just the kind of sine wave output. And so what I'll do is I'll put that into the dynamics manager, which allows me to control its dynamics and timbre. And this first source I'm just going to have in the second input of the mixer because I'm probably not going to do any panning with it. So I'm going to open that up, and I've got the dynamics manager, this one on low pass gate. So if I open that up, just get a pure tone. That's some nice, I just turn my headphones down. Alright. One thing that I don't often do with the 261 is play with the high order pot on the timbre section, mainly because it just makes it really thin. But it could be cool to use that as a kind of a thin source. Has a really brittle, kind of brutal sound. Might be interesting to kind of start with something that has a lot of complexity to it. And the cool thing would be if I were to start with that, maybe modulating either the high order or even the timbre or everything, to get something that has some kind of brittle articulation. Probably won't talk all the time just because I also need to think. This is the first time I'm doing this, so just getting a sense of it. Okay, so in the 261 we have the modulation side. There's nothing in the modulation oscillator that allows me to connect it directly to the high order. There's no normalization. It's only for timbre and amplitude. Let me just see if I do the amplitude. Yeah, okay. I didn't realize that. That's interesting. One thing I didn't realize is that, so when you're modulating this side with the amplitude controlling this, it's actually the waveform will change which waveform is modulating it. But I think if you were just to modulate the pitch, give it a bit more too. Yeah, it's just the sine wave when you're modulating pitch. What about for timbre? Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so the 261's modulation oscillator only it's only for the pitch that you're only using the sine wave oscillator. Okay, so that's not that cool. One thing that I'm curious about though is this CB output. And I know this will be full range, but I'm not sure if it's going to be the timbre, the wave-shaped output of the modulation oscillator into the high order. Put it into low range. Yes, it is. Okay, cool. It is the timbre one. That's interesting. So it's going from its lowest range, so no high order, so really pure, to that really buzzy, nasally tone. Okay. Couple of things this makes me think of straight away. First thing is there's a few other things here that I could modulate. This is set on timbre, but I'm not using the internal modulation index. I'm going to do it externally. So because we're using the kind of square wave side of things, maybe what I'll do is I'll take this one out and I'll put it in the sample and hold of the 267E. This is the random B. I'm going to open that up so I've got a full range of values. But another thing is that if I'm going to be using this modulation oscillator for some things, what about I immediately patch this into the sequencer so that I've got that same modulation oscillator moving the sequencer, and we can play with that later. Now I've got this sample and hold out. In this system, I don't have any way of scaling or attenuating this any CV that's changing the high order. The high order doesn't have like an attenuator like the timbre does, but that's okay. Could be an interesting thing to play with. So as I move this, it changes the speed of the 250E. But I've got these sample and hold outs here, and I can scale them using the random scaling. So let's have a look. Let's use this sample and hold, and I'll turn the random right down. What we might do first of all is change the timbre. So I'll open up the... first of all, I think I might open up the attenuator full, and then I'll just add some... Okay, what's that giving? That's interesting. So what am I doing here? I'm changing the wave shape of the modulation oscillator, and it seems like even when it's on sine, it's still able to trigger the sample and hold. So that might be something interesting to modulate as well. So when it's on its full, we've got this kind of swung thing going on. Let's open it right up. Okay, cool. So when it goes high, ba-ding, ba-ding, ba-ding. When it goes high, that's when it's triggering the sample and hold. So we get a timbral change when it goes high. Yeah. I don't really like this digital aliasing when it's down low, so I can scale that using the low pass gate so that I don't have too. Just make sure that's in the center so it's not too bright. Okay, that sounds alright for now. Alright, what I might do now is I'm going to get another source. So what it's making me think of is that there's like all this high frequency stuff, even when it's down low with the high order, because I'm changing the timbre. So even if I didn't have any high order modulation, we do have some high frequencies in there because we're changing the timbre. So I've got this, I don't know why that's going so slow. Because it's only clocking it on the upside. That's fine. All right, I'm just trying to work out what I'm doing. Cool. All right, so that's fine. I'll put the high order back in. That's kind of cool. All right, let's do this. Can I do that? Okay. Maybe what I'll do is I'll change the amplitude, but I'll use one of the outputs. That's what I'll do. So I've got internal modulation of the amplitude of the principal oscillator. At the moment, there's nothing on the modulation index. And what we're doing is we're modulating the amplitude with the internal. But to give it a bit of articulation, what I might do is I'm going to zero these out. We might just have a shorter sequence here. So we'll just jump back to 1. Oh, whoops, hang on, I've done the wrong one. So have a shorter sequence. So I'll choose maybe a 7-step sequence. So when we're on the 7th step, it jumps back to 1. So we've just got 7 steps. So I'll make sure I zero these out. And what I'll do is I'll make sure that each step of the first ring changes how much. Okay. That's interesting. Okay. So what I've got going is I've got one modulation oscillator, but at the moment seems to be just kind of, well, it's just regular. Back and forth, not being modulated. I'm changing the high order, and then I'm also clocking a sample and hold, which is giving me some values which go into the timbre input. So we're modulating timbre randomly, we're modulating the high order regularly, and then I've got a sequencer over here with 7 steps, and I've just kind of dialed in a few steps. And what that's doing is it's opening up the attenuator to the internal modulation bus, and then I'm changing the amplitude with this ring. So what that means is that for each, as we open this up, there's more amplitude modulation on the steps that have got an open step on the sequence. So we're getting some, without using any amplitude modulation in the 292E, we've already got amplitude modulation here. So I wonder, so it's already kind of articulate, which is cool. Oh, that's interesting. So I'm actually hearing that 7-step sequence. Alright, that immediately makes me think of, there's some amplitude modulation. But if I were to then also use some further amplitude modulation by using a looping function generator. So this is looping without any change to it. But I might grab the same sample and hold output. So when it goes really high, it should, oh, what am I doing? Oh no, okay, yeah, alright. So I might use that sample and hold output to change the decay time of this one here. So although it's kind of chaotic, there's a regularity to it. But now I've got a looping function generator that's using the same sample and hold that's randomly or chaotically, randomly changing the timbre, and I will use that to change the decay time of a looping function generator, which is trained on the low pass gate. So let's see what this does. Even more articulation. That's fine. I thought that might give a little bit more articulation than that, but maybe if I change it to low pass gate. There we go. What if I open up the attack? So here I'd want low pass gate. Haven't changed the symmetry yet. I wonder what that gives when I open up the symmetry on that oscillator. Ah. Okay, that's interesting. So what I'm doing, I'm just listening to this and hearing this pulsation with some chaos going on in terms of its articulation. It makes me think that this symmetry, as I open it, it's almost like it goes down an octave as I open that up, just because of the way the harmonics work with the wave folding. Might be cool to trigger that every now and again. So the way that I would do that is I might take a pulse output from one of the stages or more of this sequence, and at the moment there's no pulses, so I got to program a pulse. Alright, so let's do it on the first pulse. So there's going to be a pulse sent out. There's a pulse sent out on the first pulse. Let's see that pulse. There we go. So that pulse is sent out, and it triggers a sample and hold on the other random generator, and then I can tune how much random output goes at the start of, on the first step of the sequence, to the symmetry. There we go. Seems to stay high a lot, so I might dial back. Just checking the... There we go. Checking the speed of this looping envelope generator so I can see if I can actually get some more articulation there. It's interesting. It seems kind of buried, that amplitude modulation with from the 281, and it's varied because there's so much amplitude modulation coming from the oscillator itself. But it's an interesting one, and it could allow me to relate something derived from this to something else. All right, let's try that. All right, so at this point, I've got something that is doing a thing. I can't guarantee it's going to stay that way, but let's get rid of it. So it's there. I'm just going to see what I can do with something else. All right, so I've got this. I've got this looping source. Could be cool to double that looping source and put it in another input. Now I'm thinking about something kind of panned. So what we're going to do is I'm going to grab this open channel in the 292, put it in the first mixer channel, which is a panning channel. Might change the speed of this and then use the mix out, which is the kind of smooth modulation from random A, and then use that for panning. At the moment we've got no source in there. But what I'm thinking, the first thing that I'm thinking is that maybe I can tap the output of the, I don't know if this is going to work, but I'm going to tap the output of the first channel of the 292 and put it in the bandpass filter, the first bandpass filter. I often like feeding the bandpass filters back on each other, but and that might be nice for some timbral modulation, variation rather. But first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to see what it sounds like if I then put this signal into this LPG. And I will actually put it in low pass mode. So we've got this looping function generator, which is going into the second, so the B input of my 292, which is taking a filtered version with no modulation yet, a filtered version of my original sound, this one, and it's panning around. So let's have a listen to that first. Right. Now that seems to be hanging to the left. I think that's because my random range is pretty... I've dialed back the random range because I don't want the symmetry that the sample and hold is controlling to be too high. Okay, so that's not the source that I'm going to use then. But what I will do is I'll take random B, and because random B, the sample and hold out, is going to an attenuator, so I can actually scale back that timbre. Let's have a listen to the original source. That's where it was before. If I dial it back, then I can actually open up the random source itself. So this is on full speed on the random and full values, but I'm dialing back where it's going to in the timbre input. That's cool. Okay, which means that now I've got a, it's really fast, but I can dial back the speed. That's fine. For my panning modulation of the second source, I can grab it from this smooth mix out of random B, and this will be wild, panning wise. It's cool. All right, well, at least it's even left and right now, which is what I want, and I can slow that down. There we go. All right, let's play with the filter. Play with the Q. Okay, so remembering that I've got this same amplitude modulation going on for this source. So we'll listen to them together. Already that's kind of cool. probably too related in terms of their amplitude at the moment. I wouldn't mind a bit more spatial movement. But we can't, because they're so related in terms of their volume, you don't necessarily feel the panning. As soon as you take out that middle, you don't feel the panning. But, however, if I feed it back on itself and I play with the modulation, we're going to get quite a different sound. So let's play that, dirty it up. So let's start with amplitude modulation. So I've got the filter, which is filtering the original sound. I can play with the filter, but then I've got its output feeding back into the modulation input, which I've got trained on amplitude modulation. So the filter's modulating itself. It's going to go a bit crazy. Not as crazy as I thought. Let's open up the cue. There we go. Okay, that's cool. Let's try frequency modulation. There we go. What am I doing? I'm just... That's interesting. If I dial back the cue of the filter, I hear more of the sound piping through, but we get these clicks. What if I added some bandwidth modulation? No. No, I think frequency modulation is probably the best. Alright, let's pair that with the original. It's pretty spiky. Okay, that's alright, but I think I can make this sound better. Alright, what if I take a random output from the mix above? Now this is kind of attenuated, but let's see what happens if I put that in the modulation input. I'm not hearing much of the original at all now, which is good, I guess. Alright, so I'm kind of tuning the filter and the modulation, the offset of the modulation control. Oh, that's kind of cool. It's like a balance between hearing where it's come from and just giving us something, giving us something new. So let's open up the original. Alright, I'm gonna, that's cool. Alright, I'm gonna play with the waveform of this modulation oscillator and see what happens. What if I change the frequency of the modulation oscillator? Okay, I like that. I like that. So now we've got less of a sense of a pulsation. There's no pitch modulation going on at all with anything. It's just timbre modulation and amplitude modulation, plus some feedback and panning. Okay, so one thing that I'm thinking now, just as I hear these sounds together and by themselves, so like just that. It's a really complex sound, but it's also really spiky. Hard to predict when it's going to pop out. So it's very dynamic. This original one's quite dynamic as well. Actually, looking at the looping envelope generator now, which I've left to its own devices, I wonder if I can speed that up and what that would give. Especially with chaotic source. That's kind of cool. But knowing all this, one thing that could be cool, and just kind of putting it in channel 5, is just having the ability to drone out the original tone without any of that timbre modulation. So it'll still have its amplitude modulation, I think. But I've just taken the sine wave output of the 261E. So we've been working with the timbre output. And I wonder if the amplitude modulation will still come through. So open up number 5. So I've just got the sine wave. Ah, that's interesting. Right, so this mod bus will only work, even with amplitude, which I find a bit strange, will only work with the 261E principal oscillator with its wave-shaped output. So here I'm just droning it. It's the same tone. So if I open up the original source, it gives us a bit of a core sound. We're only using one little thought bubble. We're only using one envelope so far. everything's controlled by this modulation oscillator, which I like. Even the sequence. So if I bring in this chaotic shit, I'm going to save this as a preset. Cool. So I think what I need is a new source that starts off by itself. And what I mean by that is a new source that doesn't actually start with any relationship modulation wise to anything else. So I've got two more oscillators here. Well, one oscillator itself, the 259E, but it's got a mod side and a principal side. So I'm thinking about something kind of jittery. It could be using another filter, or could be just using the oscillator itself. What do I want to do here? I feel like I want another pan source, something a bit different. All right, well let's try this white noise idea. All right, but the panning, this is going to hem me in a little bit, because in terms of panning, I don't want to use any more random panning for this. So I'm going to use the modulation oscillator here, and I'm going to put it in triangle mode in low frequency, and I can dial that back. We could change might even use the same, let's do it. We'll use the same output from the sequencer to modulate the speed of the panning. And then we're going to grab, it's getting complex already. We're going to pan using this modulation oscillator. So do we have anything in there at the moment? Yeah, we do. I shouldn't have done that. I should have actually gone. So we've got this filter, which is by default. No, I think I need to patch that up. I'm going to take the flat white noise and then use that as my source to the second filter. There's no modulation going on, that's fine. I'm going to take its output, going to put it into the 292E, put it in on something kind of jittery. That's what I said before. So we've got this looping oscillator down here. I might set things up so I might be able to bring in something using the oars. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the OR CD output, and that's going to go into 292 channel C, which is where I'm going to put where I have put my source, and then I need to take its output and put it into old mate over here. Now there's no modulation going on, it's just straight up. So we've got this jittery thing, and it should have some changing panning. I might turn down that drone. change some of the quality of the filter. So its panning speed is being changed by the sequence. So let's see how that sounds when I put the original one in. I can tune it. So I'm just like manually changing the attack of the envelope that's controlling it. I wonder if I can grab something else to do that, so I'm gonna, let's steal the same modulation that I'm using for the modulation index of my first filter. I'm going to change the attack. Sounds a bit flat. So it's the fifth. It's bringing this crazy shit. It's interesting in that feedback sound. The filter resonance, it's got this almost like it's got this like weird squelchy feedback melody in there, which is kind of chaotic. I wonder if I might also feedback this second filter on itself. I mean, this could be a bit crazy, but let's give it a go. It's on amplitude at the moment. Let's have a listen to it. Just gonna maybe dirty it up. Let's store this so we don't lose it. Okay, that's cool. Adding harmonics. That's interesting. Change pitch as I... Yeah, okay, so that's amplitude modulation. So what I've got is, it's basically just white noise into this second filter. The filter has got really high resonance. It's going out to to channel C of the 292E and then being panned around using the modulation oscillator of the 259E. We haven't used the principal oscillator yet. So there's a relationship between the modulation, just working this out for myself, there's a relationship between the modulation speed, which is currently mapped to panning, of of the modulation oscillator of the 259E, and the amplitude values coming from this sequencer working on this source. So that's cool. But as I open up the feedback amplitude modulation, which is coming from itself, so fed back and modulating itself, it goes from this kind of more pure bandpass filter resonance to something that has grit. I mean, if I were to put it to frequency modulation like the other one, you'll get that kind of clicky stuff, I think. Yeah, more crazy, which I don't think I want for that. Let's put bandpass. No. Sorry, bandwidth. Alright, so just amplitude. Yeah, that just gives it some saturation, which is interesting. And again, we've got a looping function envelope for this one, which is changing the amplitude of this source. And that looping function at first was just free running, but I've related it to the same source that, it's coming from the mix, the smooth output of the random A, which is controlling the modulation depth of this other stereo source. So even though you can't really hear the relationship because we're relating speed of envelope modulation to something else, internally there's some kind of resonance between the two sources. Some drone. I'm just opening up and down the amplitude modulation of this white noise source because it's interesting as you really increase the modulation. It doesn't go into crazy clicky territory, but it does change the pitch. Something about the modulation of this filter with amplitude. As you increase the depth of modulation, it brings it up a semitone. I don't know why. Let's save that. So that could be something to modulate. So I'm just dialing in with my hand. All right. So what other kind of modulation source do I have? Now with this, the interesting thing about this, the filter, or the constraint with this filter and its modulation sources is none of the controls, the CV inputs, have any attenuverters. So what that means is if I were to put some kind of control voltage into the modulation index of the filter, then it's just going to be full range, and this pot acts as an offset. So if I had it down at 0 and I gave it an envelope that was looping back and forth, then it would just go from 0 modulation, so 0 feedback to itself, to full feedback to itself. But what would be cool is to actually be able to dial this in. I don't have an attenuator module yet, but I do have this. I do have the 250E, which I'm only using one row of, and because I'm clocking this, I can actually use the time row or the second row to do that. So maybe what I'll do is I'll start with the second row. It's on interpolation, and what that means is that each step can slide depending on the time values down here. So I think that's what I want, but what I'm going to do first is I'm going to zero out each step in the second row of CB outputs, and I might also just zero out the time steps. Now they're not going to affect the time because I'm externally clocking the 250E, but they'll be useful for choosing the modulation speed, the slewing speed when I'm on interpolation with this. So where I'm going with this is that I want this source, and let's just open up the I'm opening up the LPG so we don't have any modulation. So just so I can hear it. So we're starting. So there's some dirt with that extra harmonic. I'm going to put this into the modulation index. We don't have any values yet, and we're on interpolation. But let's make the interpolation time quite slow, which means I have to open up these time pots. And we're going to make them pretty consistent for each stage. And maybe what I'll do is I'll just have two values, like okay, so that goes bring back that. Maybe change the offset. That's better. It goes through a better range. Okay, so let's just, for myself, just explain what's happened here. So I found an interesting. I started something really basic, white noise into a resonant bandpass filter. I tuned it, and I've tuned it to the fifth of this. Right, so that's cool. Just because that's the way it came out and sounded good. And then I've added some modulation to it, so we've got panning and amplitude modulation using the LPG. But then I started feeding it back on itself, so feeding its output back into its own modulation input via amplitude modulation, which I've chosen. And I realized by playing with the modulation index, so how much modulation is going on, I realized that if you push it past a certain point, it actually moves up a semitone. So we're actually going from, in musical terms, from the fifth of the tonal center up to the flat 6 or the sharp 5. And I'm using this second ring. It's probably a bit slow, a bit faster than I want it to be, but that's okay. I'm using this second ring in interpolation mode to do that sliding between that fifth or the dominant and the flat 6. No. That's cool. And then bringing back in that crazy source. Okay, so in doing this, in kind of focusing my attention on this last source here, which has been the white noise fed back on itself, and just kind of focusing my attention on where the modulation from different parts of the patch can affect it to kind of integrate it. What I've done is I've kind of taken for granted, or not taken for granted, I'm just riffing here. I've kind of like fixed in my mind that speed of this sequence, which before I was kind of playing around with the speed of the modulation oscillator. At the moment it's really regular, so you know you've got this but there's nothing to say that I have to keep it there. But at the moment it's kind of congealed and just it seems to be the way I hear it anyway, seems to be that and the tonality of this drone seems to be the thing that's kind of holding the patch together. So if I bring in this other feedback source, so before I change the speed of the modulation oscillator, I might just play with its wave shape a bit, see how it changes the rest of the patch. There's something else that I just thought of. I've got two. This is kind of classic with me. Like I'm like, oh, I've got two more inputs. What can I do? Just made me think, because I'm kind of playing with this modulation oscillator. Just thinking as I talk. I've got two audio outputs. I haven't used the audio outputs of this modulation oscillator at all, the thing that has been driving everything. I just use its CB output because I'm using it for modulation and for clocking. But I know that if I take not the sine wave output, but the timbral output of it, you get this kind of like, you know, it's a low frequency mode, so it's really just a rising edge back and forth. But I've done this before where you actually get interesting click. Obviously it's twice as fast as the sequence itself, but if I play with let's put that in relationship to the Okay, so I've got a silly idea just to test. I like that. But what if this source, I got rid of the panning and I just put it in a standard channel here and I put it in the center. So we got two chaotic sources. One's centered and one's panned. That allows me then, I'm thinking 2 steps ahead all the time, that allows me then to use this clicky source and pan that. Yeah, that could be cool. But instead of using this modulation oscillator to pan it, so I'm getting rid of this modulation that I originally did for the panning of the white noise. What if I actually got it to pan itself? So this clicky thing, as we remember, this will just be on the right. But if I actually used that same modulation source to pan itself, then theoretically, because it's bipolar, it should just, for every click, it should go to a different ear. That's kind of cool. So I wonder how that sounds if I put that relationship with. I mean, it's pretty wild. Could just be low down in the mix. Give it a bit of clickety-click articulation. Might compete with my crazy feedback source in the stereo field. Cool. Okay, so there's probably room to add one more source. I mean, now we've got one whole oscillator that's not being used. We've also got one more channel here. We've also got another another envelope and another LBG. So like I can keep working with that, and I probably will actually, but I just need to check the time of my recording. Still recording. It's past an hour. Yeah, I mean, yeah. Let's keep going. Okay, cool. So like, no, actually, I think I'll probably leave that there. I'll leave that there. So I've got some interesting sources. Let's just recap. So I've got this original source. This is made by using the modulation oscillator as both amplitude and high order modulation to the principal oscillator of the 261E, and then using that to clock some random variation, which is giving me timbral variation. That's going elsewhere as well. But then I've got this looping function generator, which is changing the amplitude of that. You're not hearing it so much because there's already so much amplitude modulation going on, but gives us this kind of really chaotic thing. I'm also using the modulation oscillator to clock a 7-step sequence. And remembering that the first row of this sequence is opening up how much amplitude modulation is going on in that to the principal oscillator. So that's cool. And then after that, I decided to add kind of a crazy feedback sound based off the LPG'd or amplitude modulated original source. I'm feeding it back on itself through frequency modulation. So when I say feeding it back on itself, I mean I'm feeding its output back to its modulation input, and I'm modulating how much the modulation index is affecting that modulation. So we get this kind of crackly stuff going on with the original sound kind of poking through. It's also got some random panning going on. So that's cool. Then I also decided that it'd be nice to just have the tone itself. Then the last thing that I was working on was, oh, not this one. I started panning this. Now I've put it in the center, but which is just white noise tuned to the fifth above. And I've got a looping function generator that's also sharing some of the same modulation to change its attack time. I was originally panning that by having a modulated modulation oscillator from the 259E that was changing the panning. But then when I decided that I wanted to have some clickety-click from the modulation oscillator that's driving everything, and I wanted that to be panned like this, I decided to center this original channel, which is kind of nice because it means that it doesn't compete in the stereo field with this other more chaotic thing. This thing is also changing pitch because I've decided that I'm going to use output 2 of the 250E to modulate how much of the modulation index, how much I'm changing the modulation index in this white noise feedback sound. I realized that feeding it back on itself gave some extra harmonics, but then as I was dialing it in, I realized that, yeah, okay, so it also changes pitch, so I've dialed that in. So yeah, the whole thing. I'll play with the mix a bit. So just thinking that as something that's performative, just thinking ahead. One thing I really like to do is kind of introduce the source that has been the core element of a patch, not immediately. So like all these kind of things that have evolved off it or have been offshoots of it that have part of its either its sound itself or its modulation embedded in it, have them be revealed first. Maybe have some kind of a bass tone or some bass as in frequency, but bass as also as in kind of the foundation tone that anchors everything. And then only after a little while do you reveal what has caused everything. That's kind of a bit of a performative trait of mine. I like to I would bring this in maybe a little bit later. But yeah, obviously there's much more to do. I've got open channels that I can use. I've got an oscillator that's not being used. I'm only using 7 steps. I could play around with the different steps. I've only got, this is all just on one preset. I could change those presets. I haven't done any physical control at all. So there's plenty more where this can kind of evolve to, and I might play around with that before I actually record something.